You're listening to the Coast Business Radio podcast.
Dr. Malcolm Davis is a senior analyst in defence strategy and capability at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. His expertise is space policy, space security, strategy and capability development, future warfare and military technology, and Chinese military modernisation. Dr. Davis, welcome.
Many thanks.
Now, the investigation into China and the virus, do you think it will achieve much, or is more likely to come from an alternative US investigation?
Look, I think it's important that we do an independent inquiry into the origin of the virus in China. Everyone understands that it came from China, from the Wuhan area, and most likely it spread from animals in the wet market there into humans and spread from there. So the basic facts are well understood, but I think it's important that nevertheless we do a thorough and independent inquiry to trace exactly it went from a small-scale outbreak into a global pandemic, and what were the actions of the Chinese government in not being transparent with the international community and not sharing information, so that we have some chance in the future of avoiding a similar occurrence.
What do you think will be the enduring impact of the current diplomatic spat? Is our relationship with China shifting to something different?
Look, I think we are in a situation whereby a lot of key people are starting the relationship after the outbreak of COVID-19, and in particular, we're looking at China in a different sense based on their actions in terms of managing the outbreak and engaging with the international community, and also their role in shaping the World Health Organization's response to the virus. So I think that we are looking at them through a different lens, and their response to our leadership in calling for the inquiry through imposing trade tariffs, through what people are now calling wolf warrior diplomacy, which is very aggressive against us, is, I think, showing them in a different light. And that's generating a lot of debate within the strategic policy community between those who are saying, look, we need a complete reset and rethink about the relationship and not be so dependent on China, versus those who say, look, we can't rock the boat, we can't anger China, let's get back to the way it was before. Now, I'm certainly in the former camp. I do think we need a complete reset, and we do need to diversify our trading relations, but it is going to be an interesting debate going forward.
Will it affect our other policies towards China then?
I think that it could affect the entire spectrum of policy engagement with China, everything from trade, tourism, international students, financial relationships, all the way through to defence and national security. And so it really needs a thorough review, not just at the federal level, but also at the state level. And I think that, the whole situation in Victoria with Daniel Andrews moving ahead with an engagement with China on the Belt and Road Initiative is indicative of the sort of problems we're facing now, whereby China is trying to engage us at the state level to weaken the federal resistance to things like the Belt and Road Initiative.
Victoria is locked in critical final stage negotiations with Beijing over investments worth billions of dollars. Now, the deadline for Victoria to sign an investment roadmap which ties the state to the communist giant is just weeks away. Is this something that can be legally pursued by a state against the Commonwealth position in relation to Chinese investment in critical infrastructure? And will any of this investment be regarded as critical, and do we know what it is?
Look, I think that what the federal government needs to do is intervene in this process to ensure that Victoria does not sign deals and make agreements that are harmful to Australia's national security interests. And I think that that's critical, and we need to move fast on that. So there does need to be a greater degree of federal intervention against Victoria to make sure that they don't do things that would be detrimental to Australia's interests.
Is Victoria's participation in such a scheme unprecedented?
It certainly is. Here you have a state signing a deal with a authoritarian foreign power who very clearly has a strategic agenda that is inimical to Australia's interests in many respects, and they're signing deals that are secret, that they're not sharing with either the rest of the Australian nation or with the Victorian people, and that are fairly loosely worded from what I can see, that gives the Chinese government an awful lot of leeway to impose pressure on Victoria to make concessions left, right and centre. So I do think it is unprecedented, and this is why I'm saying that the federal government does need to step in at this point, bring a halt to the whole thing and impose a thorough review of the deal with basically no hidden agreements. And Daniel Andrews really does need to work with the federal government rather than resisting them and aligning with the Chinese Communist Party.
What's the significance of Taiwan and its relations with the US and other countries, and how China views these other countries' relations with Taiwan?
Well, look, China claims that Taiwan is part of its territory. In fact, the People's Republic of China has never controlled the island of Taiwan. So their claim that Taiwan is part of China is, I think, unjustifiable and illegal. So Taiwan certainly see their future as separate from China. And I think that what you're now starting to see is a greater number of states question what is known as the one country, two systems model, whereby we accept that Taiwan is part of China, but they have a different system to mainland China. I think that Hong Kong showed that one country, two systems is a lie, and therefore we're starting to ask questions about what would happen to the 24 million Taiwanese people were they to be placed under the control of China. I think the situation would be similar to what is happening to the million or so Uyghurs that are in concentration camps in Xinjiang province. And we can't afford to allow the Taiwanese people to suffer a similar fate. So I do think that what you will see is a greater number of states, including Australia, starting to seek closer relationships with Taiwan and distancing themselves from the one country, two systems policy.
How is Taiwan positioning itself at the moment?
Taiwan, I think, is playing a very astute and pragmatic approach. They're saying clearly to China that we don't accept one country, two systems, that we don't accept China's promotion of what's known as the 1992 consensus, which states that any negotiations on integration should be from the basis that Taiwan is part of China. Taiwan does not accept that, and I think that's quite a legitimate stance to take. So what Taiwan is trying to do is resist Chinese coercion. That coercion is occurring through military means, with aggressive patrolling by the PLA around Taiwan. It's also occurring through economic and diplomatic coercion. Taiwan is trying to resist that while strengthening relationships with other states. And I think Taiwan is playing a very sensible and pragmatic approach to very clear Chinese coercion.
China has always played the long game, but do you see the long game becoming shorter, especially with issues such as Taiwan, the South China Sea and Hong Kong?
Look, I think that President Xi will seek to make a decisive move in those areas. They're already starting to put in place a new law in Hong Kong that would give China the ability to go in and simply arrest large numbers of people who challenge China's authority. That's happening as we speak. But certainly options for China in the South China Sea and Taiwan are very clear. China, the current situation emerging out of COVID-19 as a window opportunity for it to exploit because the US has its attention focused on trying to manage an ongoing pandemic inside the US and the economic damage that that's generating. And there are concerns about US military readiness as well as a result of COVID-19. So the risk is that China will be tempted to exploit that and either move to strengthen its position in the South China Sea or move to increase coercion against Taiwan, potentially by imposing an air and naval blockade to increase that coercion against Taipei.
How will China's stance affect Australian strategic policy then?
Well, look, I think that's the key question. We have to decide just how we respond to China. There is a growing debate within Australia's strategic policy community, of which I'm a member, about how we deal with our relations with China. Some are advocating that we simply accommodate and acquiesce to China's interests and not rock the boat. Others are saying we should push back hard, and certainly I fall into that latter camp. And I think that debate that's occurring within the strategic policy community is indicative of a broader picture of the Australian government starting to rethink its relationship with China. We obviously want to engage with China in a manner that is not inimical to our national interests or our national security. And so trade is important, but it shouldn't be engagement at any cost. And I think this is the policy that's probably going to emerge, whereby we have a much more careful and pragmatic approach rather than simply giving everything to China in return for the economic investment that they produce here.
Read a really interesting article in the Australian from Michael Evans from the Times, of course, and he writes that America would be defeated in a sea war with China and would struggle to stop an invasion of Taiwan, according to a series of eye-opening war games carried out by the Pentagon. Now, where does this leave Australia?
Well, look, I think that the Evans piece, and I've read it, and I've read a great deal about those war games, I think is spot on. The US does need to address some shortcomings in its military capabilities vis-a-vis China. In particular, its over-reliance on short-range tactical air combat capabilities versus long-range capabilities. The Asia-Pacific region is a vast region, and so short-range fighter aircraft, for example, aren't really that effective in that sort of scenario, particularly when they can only be deployed from aircraft carriers that then have to penetrate deep inside what China has is the A2AD, the anti-access and air denial capabilities. So there is a problem there for the Americans. They have just their military structure to better suit the challenge from China. For Australia, I think we have to do something similar, but obviously on a smaller scale. We have to think about long-range power projection. We have to think about long-range strike, and it has to be able to be done quickly. And I think the second problem that we face is that all our military force structure, all our defence expenditure is based on systems that will take a very long time to appear. So the future submarine, for example, won't appear until 2034. The future frigate, the Hunter-class frigate, won't appear until probably the early 2030s. And so all these key capabilities that we're spending billions on won't be around in the next 10 years when a lot of critical decisions and moves will be made in our region. So I think that that's a flaw in our defence policy, that we haven't emphasised speed of modernisation. And maybe we need to think more about how we can acquire capabilities quickly, and a greater integration of unmanned systems rather than relying on these very long-term acquisitions like the future submarine and the future frigate.
COVID-19 has provided a bit of a fog for the rest of the world. Where do you see the next move by China, such as Taiwan, the South China Sea and Hong Kong?
I think that what you will see is the Chinese are due to conduct a large exercise off Hainan Island, which is in the South China Sea, to simulate the retaking of, or the taking of Pratas Island, which is an island in the South China Sea that's held by Taiwan. And this could be indicative of a move by the Chinese to step up coercive pressure against Taipei. And so what I think might happen between now and late 2021 would be a Chinese move to increase coercion against Taiwan and potentially increase their control on of the South China Sea, and that could generate a military crisis. I think Hong Kong also is a factor. Once they pass this law, then you could see a much more aggressive stance by the Chinese inside Hong Kong, and it will certainly bring out large demonstrations. And so, I think Hong Kong is set to kick off again in terms of protests and the Chinese response.
And then one wonders what would happen with the United States, because they're not happy with what's possibly going to happen in Hong Kong either.
Well, they're not. There's not a lot they can do about Hong Kong. Obviously they can't intervene there. But I think that if the Chinese were to move in Hong Kong, that would reinforce the perception in Washington, D.C. that China is starting to move aggressively to assert itself around the region, much more so than it has done so in the past. And so the US would respond accordingly to deter and counter, and that would likely see US forces deploying more regularly into areas such as the South China Sea and the Taiwan Straits to basically send a strong message to China, look, don't push too hard.
Dr. Malcolm Davis, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.